When I was younger, I was deeply misogynistic. I hated women, not in a way that made sense, not because of anything they had done to me, but because I saw them as baby animals. I didn't want to be compared to them, I didn't even want to be associated with them. If someone said I threw like a girl, I would lash out by picking fights to prove that I was nothing like them. Women were pathetic, emotional, fragile, and beneath me. Or at least that's what I've been taught. And I believed it. Then I got older and suddenly my hatred flipped. I became a misandrist. I hated men, not in a way that made sense, not because of any one specific betrayal, but because I saw them as wild animals. If a man messed up, I chalked it up as men being men. I avoided them when I could and dismissed them when I couldn't. Men were pathetic, violent, selfish, beneath me. Or at least that's what I learned. And I believed it. I'm sure you've heard of the term feminism, and while I think most people know that feminism is not the same as misandry, I know that translation gets lost for a couple people though, including both supporters and haters. For example, there are some very extremist pro-feminism who think feminism is about flipping the script and creating a matriarchy. And there is actually a term for that called genocentric feminism. Keep in mind that this is a very extreme type of feminism that most people who call themselves feminists are not referring to this type of feminism. And then there are anti-feminists who claim that it's obviously a front for man-hating propaganda. But of course, as all feminists know, at its core, feminism is about equality. Misandry, on the other hand, is hatred or prejudice against men specifically, and that's where the confusion comes in. People see angry women venting about the very real harm they've experienced at the hands of men or the patriarchy and conflate that with hating all men. I think it's important to be honest about why feminism gets such a strong reaction, especially from people who dislike the overblown idea of it. A lot of people oppose feminism because they misunderstand what it actually is. When I was younger, I didn't know what feminism was, and the only aspects I ever heard about it was from SJWs, who thought that all men were bad. So obviously, I didn't like it because some of my best friends were male. Some of my favorite creators were male. And I didn't understand why these feminists wanted to eradicate men when they make up like 50% of the population. And a lot of people still feel that way since so many hear the word and immediately conflate it with misandry, assuming that it's about tearing men down rather than advocating for gender equality. And sure, there are people who call themselves feminists while pushing anti-male rhetoric, just like there are people who misuse any movement for their own agenda. But the core of feminism has always been for fighting for dismantling systematic inequalities, not punishing men for existing. But you know who never gets punished despite deserving it? People who steal your online data. So let's talk about this video's sponsor, Aura. It's been 4 months since the election, yet I'm still getting political text messages somehow because I don't even know how they got my number, which is why I got Aura on all my devices from my iMac, my iPad, iPhone, because I want to finally be left alone. With Aura, you get actual proactive protection for your personal information and devices, all on one app. It monitors the dark web to see if your emails, passwords, or social security have been leaked. It also tracks your credit accounts and alerts you of any suspicious activity as soon as it detects anything. And if you're browsing online, Aura's got you covered with a one-click secure VPN, so you can shop, bank, and scroll privately without leaving literal digital footprints behind for some weirdo who might actually want your feed. Or even automatically request removal of your personal info from data broker lists and people search websites. But even if the worst case happens, Aura offers up to $5 million for identity theft insurance. It even scans your devices for malware, ransomware, and viruses, and all of that super cool stuff that you don't want in your system. It's stupid easy to set up. You don't need like 5 different apps for ID theft protection, antivirus, parental controls, and transaction monitoring. Aura does it all. So if you're like me and want to be safe from weirdos, visit aura.com/Shazimei, which is in my description, or scan the QR code to try Aura for 14 days. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring. Now let's get back on topic. I regularly talk about women's issues, and sometimes I talk about men's issues too. I try my best to be fair to both, but I've noticed that some people don't like it when I bring up men's struggles specifically, especially in conversations that they feel should be primarily focused on women. For example, in my video about consent, some people felt that I shouldn't have specifically mentioned men because I didn't explicitly say women, even though women are statistically more likely to be victims of assault, and statistically it's typically by men. I understand how frustrating it is when women's issues get overlooked so much, because why can't women have anything? Why do men always have to be a part of the conversation too? Because of this, sometimes I get called a pick-me. But I think some of you have really no idea what a pick-me really is. By definition, the term pick-me girl is someone who puts down other women to gain validation from men. I'm not like other girls, so please love me even if you hate women kind of behavior. These kinds of women usually shits on feminism or reinforce misogyny just to be more desirable in the eyes of men. I hope that you all genuinely remember that talking about men's struggles doesn't take away from women's struggles. Actual aggressive pick-me's that I see online tend to fall in 2 categories. They're either deeply internally misogynistic or selling something. In my What Feminism Means to Me video, I featured clips of women who were very clearly putting down other women for male approval, but their real motive was to just promote their OnlyFans, which is just extra cool because now whenever I see a woman talking about a man in any tone other than degrading, I know that there will be men immediately trying to find her explicit content because they assume her kindness must be performative. Although I do find it's a bit ironic because women who try to push the pro-men narrative without being anti-women aren't the ones who are trying to sell something. Lately, my feed has been flooded with man-hate videos, and most of them are very obviously exaggerated jokes. You can tell because many of the women making them have loving male partners who they joke about it with. They're venting in a sarcastic, over-the-top way, but at the end of the day, it's just humor. But then I get the ones who aren't joking. The ones who say, hey, do you hate men? Well, I have the perfect product for you! Believe it or not, there are female versions of the Andrew Tate pipeline. There are women who exploit other women's trauma, like how some women use the feminist branding to recruit other women into predatory multi-level marketing schemes. They exploit women's distrust of men by promoting their MLMs to empower women or helping them achieve financial independence from men, when in reality they're just being used for profit. There are social media influencers who deliberately use man-hating rhetoric to build massive followings only to sell courses, merch, or promote dropship products that have nothing to do with actual advocacy. They're capitalizing on paying for profit, just like how there have been documented cases of female traffickers who target vulnerable women, especially with those with histories of domestic violence or trauma, and lure them into exploitation under the guise of female solidarity. Misandry and misogyny are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. When you start reducing men to rigid, surface-level stereotypes, you inevitably reinforce the same gender roles that have historically oppressed women. At its core, misandry thrives on the idea that men and women are inherently fundamentally different. Misanders believe that men are violent, oppressive, and incapable of empathy, while women are inherently nurturing, innocent, pure, and morally superior. When chronically online people think of misandry, the first person that comes to mind is Drew Afualo. Drew is one of the most famous TikTok creators who speak on women's issues. I get that her style of content isn't for everyone. Maybe you think she's too aggressive, too sarcastic, or just not your type of humor. But I want to make it clear that Drew is not a misandrist. I've heard people call Drew a hypocrite, claiming that she teaches women to hate men while having a loving fiance. I even read her book because so many people use it as proof that she's a horrible person, pointing to the fact that she calls herself a bitch and mean in it. But within the actual context of her book, she explains why she embraces those labels. She calls herself mean because sometimes when dealing with those who are openly misogynistic, there's no point in being nice. Instead of internalizing the hatred and letting it break her down, she laughs at it. On every single platform she's on, whether it's TikTok, her podcast, or her book, she always specifies that her criticism is aimed at terrible men, misogynistic men, men who use their power to belittle, harm, or oppress others. And in that same book people love to use against her, she has an entire section dedicated to her fiance, describing how loving, caring, and kind he is. Right after that, she explicitly states that she knows that men can be good, and encourages women to let those good men into their lives instead of wasting time on toxic little man babies who do nothing but tear them down. If anything, Drew is the opposite of a misandrist if she actually makes misandrist women more open to the idea of trusting men again. She understands the damage misogyny causes, and instead of gaslighting women into ignoring it, she validates their frustration while also showing them that not all men are like this, using her father and her fiance as examples. Even on her podcast, she frequently invites men on as guests because she knows that the issue isn't men as a gender, it's toxic masculinity and misogyny. Drew is also a vocal trans ally, which actually shocked many of her followers when she publicly defended Dylan Mulvaney's song after it received backlash. And honestly, the fact that this was a shock speaks volumes about how normalized transphobia has become in feminist spaces. The entire point of feminism is to dismantle gender-based discrimination and uplift those who have been harmed by the patriarchy. Any feminist who refuses to stand up for trans women is actively failing at feminism. Misandrists who claim to be feminists often reject gender diversity, clinging to the idea that there's only one real way to be a man or a woman, which is how they also reject the inclusion of trans and or intersex people. Both misandrists and TERFs, which stands for trans exclusionary radical feminists, believe that women are inherently victims of men, but in actuality, Women are victims to the patriarchy, just like how men are also victims of the patriarchy. But when you're so certain that the entire gender of men is indeed the problem, and you create this narrative that manhood and womanhood can never coexist, you get transphobia. But trans people can obviously coexist with cis people. They offer such unique perspective on what gendered standards can actually get pushed, and they live through the real consequences when we fight about who's a real woman and who's not. While TERFs deny trans women womanhood, they also contradict themselves by hyperfixating on trans women's bodies in ways that are eerily similar to how misogynistic men treat cis women. Like when cis women are purposely trying to invalidate trans women and saying things like, you have a bushier mustache than me, you have hairier legs than me, you look more masculine than me, which is what misogynistic men say to cis women when they're complaining about how women look too masculine. Masculinity and femininity aren't objective truths. They're social constructs that people either use to empower or weaponize against others. Gender is performative, not something we inherently are, but something we do based on learning behaviors and societal expectations. When it comes to gendered spaces, presentation often means everything. In a society that places value on gendered spaces like bathrooms, locker rooms, and gyms, we're naturally going to keep having these discussions, because as long as we maintain gender-exclusive spaces like bathroom stalls with giant cracks in between the doors and urinals that sometimes don't even have dividers instead of just toilet rooms, the expectation will be that people look the part of the gender they identify with. It doesn't actually matter if you're trans or cis, but as long as you look the part and keep your mouth shut, no one will care. A trans woman who passes as traditionally feminine would likely still be welcomed into a cis woman-only gym without issue, because realistically, these spaces aren't going to start doing DNA tests or chromosome checks, because that would be invasive, impractical, and honestly ridiculous. Just like how plenty of masculine-presenting cis women will be the ones who face scrutiny in these places. There have been multiple cases where masculine cis women have been harassed, screamed at, or even had the police called on them because she looked too masculine in a feminine space. I know that some people think that cis women are primarily victims of trans women in these spaces, but the reality is that trans people face far more harm and violence from cis people. Most people who don't actively support trans rights or consider themselves trans allies still wouldn't want trans people to use their dead gender's bathroom just because presentation overrides their bias. A trans woman who presents as extremely feminine would face far more scrutiny in a men's bathrooms than in a women's one, simply because she visibly looks like a woman. The same goes for trans men who are heavily masculinized. People don't want them in the women's bathroom because based on appearance, they register as men. There's a frustrating double standard I've noticed with misgenders who infantilize trans men and gay men, as if they're somehow less capable of being dangerous simply because they're not straight or cis. A perfect example of this is when the man versus bear question was being passed around. Some people said I'd only pick the man if he was queer, but the whole point of choosing the bear over the man is based on the worst case scenario, since at worst a bear would maul you, but a human could do something incredibly worse. Just based on risk assessment, when you're alone, isolated, or vulnerable, the orientation or gender identity of the man is irrelevant. A stranger is still a stranger. Trans men and gay men are just as capable of violence as straight cis men, and the infantilization just downplays the reality that anyone, regardless of gender or sexuality, can be dangerous. The capacity for harm isn't limited by identity. Well, yeah, statistically cisgendered straight men do commit the majority of violent crimes. Weaponizing that data to assume that all cis men are inherently dangerous while trans men and gay men are inherently safe is just flawed logic, especially since if we're statistically speaking, bears attack more frequently per encounter. You don't pick the bear because the man might be a cis straight white man. You pick the bear because it's not human with a twisted sense of creativity. In contrast to that, I've also seen some progressives complain about the general idea of men and include trans men in that blanket criticism. Hating men as a concept doesn't just harm cis men, it inevitably spills over onto trans men too. Even when people are trying to be progressive or inclusive, reducing trans men to just another part of the male problem erases their experiences and oversimplifies the struggles they face. Trans men already experience marginalization. They're targeted by transphobia, often dismissed or misgendered, and still face gender-based violence. Treating them as part of some generalized men are trash rhetoric isn't progressive. I assume that progressive intersectional feminists don't want to villainize trans men because of the fact that they don't want to be transphobic. But then if you're going to accept trans men, you have to recognize cis men too. Trans men are still, at the end of the day, men. And when you make men the enemy, you inevitably end up making collateral damage out of people you claim to support. Many misandrists claim to reject the patriarchy, but their belief system still relies on it. Sexism is still intolerance even when it's directed at men. In their attempt to oppose misogyny, some misanders end up reinforcing the same patriarchal ideals they claim to reject. The belief that men are inherently violent, emotionally stunted, or incapable of empathy is just as reductive and dehumanizing as the stereotypes used against women. The patriarchy doesn't just harm women because it also imposes rigid, limiting roles on men. Treating men as inherently dangerous or inferior just feeds into the patriarchy. It perpetuates the same gender existentialism that patriarchy is built on, which is just the idea that gender defines a person's value or morality. Beyond the hypocrisy, misandry also directly undermines feminist goals. It makes it easier for anti-feminists to dismiss legitimate concerns by pointing out misandrous rhetoric as proof that feminism is just about hating men, when it's not. True feminism fights against oppression of all genders, not just one. And hating men only strengthens the system you claim to despise. But I don't know. That's just me. Laters.